It is a technology that promises to rewrite the fundamental laws of economics. A paradigm shift so violent, it makes all previous industry obsolete. The demand is infinite. The potential is limitless. And the stock market, it has detached itself from reality. Valuations are doubling by the week. To question the price is to be labeled a dinosaur, a Luddite who cannot see the future. Waiters, clergy, and poets are emptying their savings accounts to buy shares in companies that exist only on paper. Maps with lines drawn in red ink, connecting muddy fields to empty towns. You think I am talking about artificial intelligence in 2025? I am not. I'm talking about steam in 1845. We are currently living through the greatest technological hype cycle in 80 years. But if you want to know how this story ends, if you want to know what happens to your portfolio when the euphoria breaks, you do not need to study the NASDAQ. You need to study the railway mania, and you need to meet the man who invented the modern financial bubble. History calls him a fraud, a thief, the railway king who stole the crown. But to understand the crash, you must first respect the builder. George Hudson was not born a monster. He was born a linen draper in York, a simple shopkeeper. But Hudson possessed a gift that the aristocrats of London lacked. He understood scale. In 1840, the British railway system was a mess. Small local lines that went from nowhere to nowhere. Inefficient, fragmented, useless. Hudson saw the solution. He realized that a train is not a product. It is a network. He began buying up rival lines, merging them, synchronizing the timetables. He created the Railway Clearinghouse. Suddenly, you could travel from London to Edinburgh without changing tickets. Coal from the north could reach the factories of the south in hours, not weeks. This was not a scam. This was a revolution. Hudson lowered the cost of transport for the entire British Empire. He unlocked billions in economic value, and because the product was real, the trust was absolute. He was hailed as a genius, a tragic visionary who believed that if he could just keep building, the economics would eventually catch up with the ambition. But ambition is expensive, and when the profits didn't come fast enough to satisfy the hunger of the market, Hudson made a choice that would turn the railway king into the architect of your financial nightmare. But a visionary needs capital. And in 1845, the British Parliament accidentally handed George Hudson the perfect weapon to weaponize human greed. They created a system called Scrip. To buy a share in a new railway company, you didn't have to pay for the whole thing up front. You only had to put down a deposit, sometimes as low as 5 or 10%. It was the Victorian equivalent of massive leverage. If you bought a share for £100, you only paid £5 today. You signed a contract promising to pay the rest later when the railway was built. To the average investor, this felt like free money. If the share price rose just 10%, you hadn't made a 10% return. Because you only put down £5, you had doubled your money, you made a 100% return overnight. This leverage effect created a narcotic high that infected the entire population. And I do mean everyone. This was not a game for just the bankers in the city of London. The mania swept through the drawing rooms of the countryside. The Bronte sisters, famous novelists living in isolation, burned their book earnings on railway shares. Charles Darwin, the man who defined natural selection, found himself unable to resist the selection of the market. There was a genuine belief that a new era had dawned, an era where the old rules of profit and loss no longer applied, an era where you could get rich simply by believing in the future of the machine. But there was a problem that George Hudson knew, but his investors ignored. Railways are capital intensive. They take years to survey, years to lay track, and years to turn a profit. But the investors wanted their returns now. So Hudson did the unthinkable. He began taking the money from new investors, the cash meant for building bridges and tunnels, and he used it to pay dividends to the old investors. He cooked the books. He moved expenses into capital accounts to make the revenue look higher. He created a perpetual motion machine of fraud. As long as new money kept flowing in, the dividends kept going out, and the share price kept rising. Most people at the time were looking at the share price. A tiny minority were looking at the balance sheet. That is the distinction we make on this channel. We look at the history of the ledger, not the history of the hype. If you want to be part of the minority that sees the cliff before the fall and understands the mechanics behind the mania, make sure you are subscribed. Because in 1845, the ledger was about to bleed. The railway king had promised a dividend of 6% in a world of 3% interest. It was mathematically impossible. And the moment the Bank of England raised rates, the mathematics finally came to collect the debt. The crash did not happen because people stopped believing in trains. It happened because the bill came due. Remember the Scrip, the contract where investors only paid 5% down? In October 1845, the Bank of England, sensing the market was overheating, raised interest rates. Money became expensive. Suddenly, the railway companies couldn't borrow easily anymore. So they turned to their investors and issued what is known as a call. They demanded the other 95%. Imagine the horror. You are a middle-class clerk. You bought shares worth £1,000, but you only had £50 in your pocket. You thought you could sell the shares for a profit before the full amount was ever due. But now, the company is demanding £950 immediately. If you can't pay, you go to debtor's prison. And because everyone knew their neighbor was also leveraged, trust evaporated instantly. Every sell order triggered 1,000 more. Panic didn't just ripple through the market, it detonated. Prices collapsed. The Scrip, which was once traded like gold, became a liability. People were actually paying others to take the shares off their hands, just to avoid the bankruptcy that came with owning them. And in the middle of this carnage, the spotlight turned to George Hudson. The Times of London began an investigation. They looked at the books. They found the holes where the capital should have been. They found the dividends paid from fresh deposits. They found the personal enrichment. The railway king was stripped of his title. He was sued by the very companies he created. He fled to France to avoid arrest, dying in disgrace. But here's the most important part of the story, the part that the history books often miss, but the financial historians know is the key. George Hudson was destroyed. The investors were wiped out. Families were ruined. But the railways stayed. The tracks were real. The trains kept running. The network Hudson built actually did revolutionize the British economy. It just didn't make the investors rich. It made the next generation rich, who bought the assets for pennies on the pound after the crash. This is the lesson for 2025. Look at the artificial intelligence boom. We are seeing the exact same pattern. We are told that AI is the future. And just like the railways, that is almost certainly true. It will change the world. It will increase productivity. But look at the capital expenditure. The massive tech giants are spending hundreds of billions of dollars. They are buying the GPUs, the steam engines. They are building the LLMs, the track. But just like Hudson's lines, many of these tracks are currently running trains with no passengers. We are in the deployment phase, where the spending is real, but the utility is still theoretical. The danger for your portfolio is not that AI is a lie. The danger is that AI is a railway. The companies building the infrastructure are being valued at perfection. But if the application layer, the people actually using the trains, doesn't generate enough profit to pay for the tracks, the capital calls will come. The technology will survive. The data centers will remain. But the investors who bought the top, they are the ones who will pay for the construction of the future, without sharing in its rewards. So, what does the wise investor do with this history? Do you sell everything? Do you run for the hills? No, that is the reaction of the amateur, driven by fear. The stoic investor is driven by observation. The lesson of the railway mania is not that technology is bad or that growth is impossible. The lesson is that the market is a pendulum that swings from despair to euphoria, and it almost always swings too far. In 1845, the crowd believed the pendulum would never swing back. They believed the laws of gravity had been suspended by the steam engine. In 2025, the crowd believes the laws of valuation have been suspended by the algorithm. They are wrong. The bubble will burst. It always does. The Scrip will lose its value. The leverage will be flushed out. But for the prepared investor, the one who holds quality, who avoids excessive leverage, and who understands that the price you pay determines the return you get, this is not a disaster. It is an opportunity. When the dust settled on the railway mania, the tracks were still there, the trains were still running, and the savvy investors who waited for the crash bought those assets for pennies, securing generational wealth that lasted for a century. We are standing on the precipice of a similar moment. Do not try to time the exact top. George Hudson couldn't do it, and neither can you. Instead, audit your own ledger. Ensure you are not holding Scrip, assets that exist only on promises and leverage. The tracks of the future are being laid today. The question is not whether the train is coming. The question is, when the dust settles, will you be the one holding the worthless Scrip, or will you be the one who steps in to buy the railroad?